Digital games. I buy them, you buy them, everybody buys them. It's pretty much the main way most people play video games nowadays. And what's not to love about digital games? The publishers save on the cost of the disc, case, shipping, etc., and you still pay the full price. Genius. All joking aside though, digital gaming is for the most part extremely convenient. You get to buy whatever games you want, whenever you want. Until you can't anymore. Delisting games is what happens when publishers decide for some reason or another that they don't want to sell a certain game anymore, so they pull it from digital storefronts. So that's what I want to look at today. A brief overview of just some of the many delisted games that you can't buy anymore. One of the most common examples of delisted games are sports games, but in particular racing games. And this is just because most of these games license out real cars from real manufacturers to put in the games, and those licenses are expensive to pay for and renew. The main series that come to mind with racing games are F1, Forza Motorsport and Horizon, and Gran Turismo. These franchises release games frequently enough, and especially F1, which is a yearly franchise like 2K or COD, that most people move on to whatever the new entry is by the time that an older one gets taken down. And yeah, it sucks that the old ones get delisted, but the newer games usually just act as replacements for the older ones, so it isn't too big of a deal. The main exception to this is Forza Horizon, since each of those games are set in completely different locales, meaning that alone would be enough for someone to want to go back and play the older games in the series. Like speaking of Forza, Horizon 4 has now been delisted. The only one you can buy digitally off the Xbox store is Forza Horizon 5. And Forza Horizon 4 is only 5 years old. It's not an incredibly old game. But then there's also times when publishers will just delist older versions of a game if they're going to release a newer version, and Sega is probably the most notorious for this, because they delisted all of the classic Sonic games a couple years ago when the Sonic Origins collection released, so that people going forward would be forced to buy the newer, more expensive version. Stuff like that isn't what I want to talk about today. I'm more interested in more unfortunate cases of games getting delisted, the games that were delisted but got no replacement. One day they were there and the next they just vanished. I think it's best to start with one that pretty much everyone is familiar with, Minecraft. You'd have a hard time finding someone under the age of like 35 who hasn't played it or at least heard of it, since it's the highest selling single game of all time. Nowadays, Minecraft's player base is split between two main versions. You've got Bedrock, which is on mobile, modern consoles, and PCs, and then there's Java, which is exclusive to PC. But this wasn't always the case. Before Bedrock Edition was made the standard for everything that wasn't Java, every single console had its own completely separate port and version of Minecraft. These are known as the legacy editions of Minecraft, and you can't buy them anymore. Starting in 2017 with the Xbox One edition, Mojang slowly delisted all the legacy versions of Minecraft from their respective consoles to make way for Bedrock and its cross-platform capabilities. And I think it's kind of sad because for a lot of people, myself included, the legacy editions are how they first got into Minecraft. But the legacy editions of Minecraft aren't the only Minecraft games to have been delisted, since the same goes for the Minecraft Story Mode games. The 2 seasons of Minecraft Story Mode were developed by Telltale Games, and this was back when they were at their peak relevance as a studio. I didn't play past the first free episode of the first series back when it was coming out, but I remember hearing a ton of really good things about it. And I remember the one episode that was like a murder mystery with a bunch of big Minecraft YouTubers from the time was a really big deal, and it's still probably one of the coolest things to come out of anything Minecraft related. But yeah, back in 2019, due to both the licensing running out and Telltale going a little bankrupt at the time, both seasons of Minecraft Story Mode were delisted, leaving the only way to still play them to buy physical copies of each season. But Minecraft Story Mode wasn't the only Telltale game to get delisted, since practically everything that they made pre-The Walking Dead, and even some games released after that point, have been delisted. Games like Back to the Future, Jurassic Park, Game of Thrones, and Guardians of the Galaxy are all Telltale games that got delisted in the months following their closure back in 2018 leading into 2019. Even games that were made by Telltale that aren't in their signature point-and-click style were taken down, like the Poker Night games, which are a duology of poker games featuring characters like Ash from The Evil Dead, GLaDOS, Brock Samson, and Claptrap, just to name a few. They look really fun since they're basically a poker big crossover event game, and it sucks you can't play either of them anymore. And speaking of GLaDOS, Portal is actually the game that got me wanting to make this video in the first place, but not just Portal, more the orange box, which Portal is included in. Little brief context for this video, I just finished playing through the Half-Life series. I played Half-Life 1 and its expansions on my laptop, and then I played Half-Life 2 and its episodes on the Xbox Series X through the orange box, which I have on disc. And playing the orange box got me thinking, and I realized that Valve has delisted most of their games off of any digital platform that isn't Steam. And ironically enough, since I used Portal as the segue into this entry, the Portal duology are the two Valve games that have managed to stay up, on the Xbox store at least. I don't know if they're on PlayStation. But yeah, the orange box has been delisted, meaning that you can't get Half-Life 2, Half-Life 2 episodes, or TF2 digitally anymore on Xbox. And the same goes for CSGO, which is backwards compatible on the Series X, you just can't buy it. The one that hurts the most though is that the Left 4 Dead games have both been delisted from the Xbox store. These are some of the best and most replayable zombie games ever made, and now if you want to play them on Xbox, you gotta pay way too much for a used copy. Or you could just get any of the Valve games super cheap on Steam, but let's ignore that. But these are all old games that were available to buy for a super long time before getting delisted. There's also a ton of games that got delisted in only a few years or less, such as Jump Force. Jump Force is an anime crossover fighting game and is basically the Smash Ultimate for Shonen Jump. It has pretty much everyone: Goku, Naruto, Luffy, Jotaro, etc. It was received decently, but it didn't set the gaming world on fire the way it was probably expected to, considering how many different fan bases it caters to, with just how many characters are in it. Plus, there's the fact that it was apparently horrendous for competitive play, which that is a vital thing for the longevity of a fighting game. And then the fact that the game's single-player campaign is super just laughably poorly written, with one of the worst twist villains in any game, probably ever. Like Prometheus, super lame. So yeah, nobody really cared that much about Jump Force. And sure enough, it ended up getting delisted only 3 short years after it first dropped, and the main reason is just all of the licensed characters that are in it. As opposed to something like Smash Ultimate, where Nintendo owns the majority of the characters that are in that game already, Bandai Namco had to license out all the Jump characters. So really a pretty similar situation to how a lot of the racing games end up. I don't know whether they licensed out each franchise individually, or if they just got them all under the big Shonen Jump umbrella, because I don't know, I didn't work on Jump Force. But it couldn't have been cheap either way. And with the game performing as middlingly as it did, Bandai Namco probably didn't want to continue licensing out the properties for a product they weren't making a profit on. I ended up actually getting both the game and all the DLC for super cheap right when they announced that it was getting delisted, and I played it quite a bit with my cousin, and I have to admit, it's not bad. I think it's pretty fun. I can see why I never had much of a competitive scene, but if you treat the game like the video game equivalent of smashing your action figures together, which is what it basically is, you can have a pretty good time with it. It's not bad. Trademark and licensing are the main recurring reason for why games get delisted, but it isn't always just because someone doesn't want to keep paying for the license anymore. Sometimes things are just out of the developers' and publishers' hands, like was the case with one of the most tragic examples of a shutdown and delisted game, Friday the 13th, the game. This was one of the first asymmetrical horror games to really hit the gaming scene, since it dropped less than a full year after Dead by Daylight did. For a good while, these two games were direct competitors with each other, but the two games on an actual gameplay level are too different to compare, in my opinion at least. Dead by Daylight's gameplay and community skew much more competitive, with that game having a very sweaty reputation. I don't know how accurate that is, since I've never played Dead by Daylight. I just know modern Dead by Daylight is a whole different beast than the Dead by Daylight I watched people play on YouTube back in like 2016, 2017. Friday the 13th was just always a lot more casual of a game than Dead by Daylight. It was just a pretty simple 1v7 game where Jason tries to kill all the counselors, who have several ways of escaping, like calling the cops, or repairing one of the several cars found around the map and driving away. The charm in this game comes from just the clear love for the Friday the 13th franchise that oozes from every crack of this game. All the maps and all their main landmark buildings are loving recreations of the locales from the different movies. And the same goes for Jason himself, since you can play as practically every version of the killer, save for one main exception, but we'll get to that in a minute. They even added content from Friday the 13th Part 5 in an update, including a new map and a new character so that you can play as Roy, who is the paramedic copycat Jason from Part 5, which is the very polarizing outlier Friday the 13th movie after Jason died but before he came back as a zombie in Part 6. Plus, for the game, they got Kane Hodder, who's the main Jason actor who played him from Part 6 onwards, to do mocap for the game, which is really cool, because he's basically Jason. In other updates, a single-player challenge mode was added that let you play as Jason in a couple of different curated scenarios to kill through. And then there was the virtual cabin, which was something that started before the game even came out initially, as sort of an ARG for teasing stuff that would be in the final game. The cabin would get updates over the course of the game's lifespan to tease future content, and the latest iteration of the virtual cabin teased players with the Jason X update, which people were dying for at the time, which is supposed to add the Grendel spaceship from the movie as a map and Uber Jason as the new killer. There was even supposed to be a new game mode called Paranoia that seems like it would have been kind of a lot like Among Us, but before Among Us. For Friday the 13th fans, everything was coming up Millhouse. That was until the lawsuit struck. The Friday the 13th lawsuit was a very messy affair, but the gist of it was that Victor Miller, who wrote the original screenplay for the movie, and Sean Cunningham, who was the director and producer of the movie, were suing each other over who owned the rights to the franchise. One of the side effects of the ongoing lawsuit was that Gun Media and Elphonic, who were the developers and publishers of Friday the 13th, had to stop adding new content to the game. This basically killed any momentum that the game had, and eventually it was forced to get delisted. And then just a few months ago, the servers were completely shut down at the request of the rights holders, meaning that most of the game now is completely unplayable. You can't do anything online in this game. You can't even host private games online. This means that all that you can do in the game is play against bots, you can play the challenge mode, or you can go into the virtual cabin. But since the offline mode doesn't track XP, the actual amount of content that you can use in it is pathetic. I don't know if my game is just bugged out because obviously I've played the game before and I have most of the Jasons unlocked, but you can only play as the couple that you get to start with, like Part 3 Jason and then Roy you get for free. You can't even play as a counselor in this game anymore since all the versus bots games are just for playing as Jason. This one is just really sad to me because I loved this game back in middle school when it came out, and it was really one of the first things that got me into horror that wasn't Five Nights at Freddy's Jason. This game was really one of the things that turned younger me into a horror fan, and it's just very disheartening to see that it went out the way it did. Since then, Gun and Elphonic went their separate ways for a while, with Gun ending up publishing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game that started out okay. I played it when it launched on Game Pass, and it was pretty fun, but apparently got worse over time, and now that game has too ceased development, after like 2 years. Then Elphonic went on to develop and publish the Killer Clowns from Outer Space game, which I have heard absolutely nothing about, positive or negative. But now the two companies are supposed to be working together again on a new project that a lot of people suspect is Friday the 13th related, so whatever they end up making, I hope it's good. While Friday the 13th the game was still live, it was a beloved fixture of the series and was really one of the main things that helped to keep interest in the series going, and it really scratched an itch for a lot of people. But on the other hand, you have some games that didn't seem to do anything right in the short time they were up, like Marvel's The Avengers. This game was announced back in 2017, which was really when the MCU was starting to hit its peak level of popularity, so this game really had a lot of hype behind it. The game wouldn't release until the fall of 2020, and it ended up being a 4-player, third-person looter shooter featuring superheroes, which is now a full bona fide genre, I think, because we've had Avengers, then Gotham Knights, and then Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. All of those games have failed. I don't know why they keep making them. The Avengers was on sale for like $2.99, $3.99 right before it got delisted, and I decided to scoop it up, seeing as that would be my last chance. And I probably should have spent that money on some better things. One nice thing I'll say is that all the cosmetics that you would have otherwise had to spend money or premium currency on have just been unlocked for everybody, which is a really good gesture that I think most games that are getting shut down should do. On the other hand, if you're one of the poor people who spent actual money on skins and battle passes for this game, you might feel a little differently about it. So that's just how I feel, not having played the game until it got shut down. And I think it's cool all the different outfits from all the different movies and comics that are here for all the different playable characters. But I mostly like that so I can wear the Winter Soldier suit as Captain America, which is the best suit in the MCU, and I will die on that hill. But you know what isn't so nice though? The rest of the game. This is just one of the most mediocre and just uninspired games I have ever played. And I know it doesn't get better once you beat the campaign and start doing post-game content, since that's one of the main critiques I heard about this game, was that it has no real post-game. This game is just a huge example of wasted potential. If they just made a normal 4-player co-op game that was sort of Arkham-esque and didn't have the looter shooter elements, it probably could have been much better received. But we can't have that. Every game needs to be like Fortnite with battle passes and skins, and endless repetitive missions so that the game never ends. You're gonna play Marvel's Avengers forever. At least that's what the publishers thought would be the case. Obviously it wasn't. The game failed long term and got delisted 3 years after launch. But if you ask me, it was a well-deserved failure because I'm still a little mad that I can't play as Spider-Man on the Xbox. So, thank you Sony for being so greedy with your character. But speaking of Sony, there's the latest example of a delisted game, and it was the internet's punching bag last summer when it came out, Concord. So Sony, they don't do everything right, because this was their $400 million answer to Overwatch. It released, and clearly Sony expected it to be the next big thing, since they did a decent bit of marketing, and even had a whole episode of that secret level show, the Amazon Prime show where each episode was based off a different video game dedicated to it. Concord finally released to thundering, I never played it since hero shooters aren't really my thing, but reviews were middling and sales were shittling, with it being estimated the game only sold 25,000 copies. Yes, sold, because this is a game that was supposed to compete with Overwatch 2, which is a free game, and it costs $40. And sure, it's not full price, and honestly now, $40 seems like a bargain with the price getting shot up to $80 for some games now. But most people who are into hero shooters are probably already playing Overwatch or TF2 if they're on PC. Concord sales were horrendous in general, but were especially bad when you consider the game's huge budget, and it's led to the game getting shut down in only 2 weeks, which I'm pretty sure is a record. You can't buy the game anymore, and people who bought the game on disc now basically have either a $40 bookend if they keep the game in the case, or a $40 coaster if they want to just leave the disc lying around. Sony's attempt to kill Overwatch just completely blew up in their faces, and Overwatch remained the king of hero shooters for a few more months until Rivals came out and completely stole Overwatch's fan base. But that's the thing with all the games I've mentioned so far, is you can still get them on disc, meaning that you can usually still play these games in some degree, though you may not be able to buy stuff like DLC. Not all games are fortunate enough to get physical runs nowadays, meaning that some games get delisted, and that's it. There's no legal way to acquire them ever again. Probably the most famous example of this is PT from back in 2014. This was a short demo that released on the PSN store that just had you walking through a looping hallway while scary stuff happens to you. PT stands for playable teaser, but it also stands for puzzle thingy, since that's what PT really was. It was a puzzle to solve. Once you solved it, you were able to escape the house and find out that you've been playing as Norman Reedus the whole time, and that PT was secretly a demo for the upcoming Silent Hill game. It would have been called Silent Hills, and it was supposed to be a collaborative work between Hideo Kojima and film director Guillermo del Toro, which in retrospect, that would have been awesome. But you probably are already familiar with how the story ends. Kojima and Konami have a falling out during the development of Metal Gear Solid 5, Kojima leaves the company, and Silent Hills was cancelled, although thankfully Kojima, Reedus, and Del Toro would eventually all collaborate again on Death Stranding. PT was delisted in 2015, but the impact it has on horror games, especially indie horror, cannot be understated. PT was lightning in a bottle, and it was huge on the internet with basically every Let's Player at the time making videos on it. It was kind of like Slender or FNAF, which PT actually came out less than a full week before Five Nights at Freddy's, which completely boggles my mind because I think of these games being released years apart from one another. But once Silent Hills was canceled, plenty of games tried to fill the void, with most of them either getting canceled or just not living up to expectations. I never played PT myself, since I was only 8 years old when it came out and I didn't have a PS4, but the game that has come closest to replicating PT is Resident Evil Village, and particularly the House Beneviento section. That is the single scariest level of any video game I have ever played, and I'll probably make a video on it someday. Maybe it's a Halloween special this year. But the original PT is now lost to the ether. There are plenty of fan remakes, and you could probably emulate it. I don't know what PS4 emulation looks like nowadays, but I bet you can probably run PT. If you want to play the real thing, be prepared to take out a second mortgage, because some people on eBay are charging upwards of $800 for a PS4 that has PT installed, and I would not be surprised if when the game was still more popular, people were charging 4 figures for it. No sane person should spend that much to play a single demo, no matter how good that demo is. Then there's a pair of games made by PlatinumGames, who are the developers behind Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, and the upcoming Ninja Gaiden 4. They made 2 digital-only tie-in games, The Legend of Korra and Transformers Devastation. Personally, I'm more interested in Legend of Korra since I'm just bigger into Avatar than I am Transformers, but both games were delisted at the same time in 2017 due to unrenewed licenses. The licensing strikes again. The worst thing about these 2 games is that they were never printed physically, so much like PT, you have to get a console or an account that has already purchased the game. You can also buy Steam keys for the Legend of Korra game, but those cost over $300, which again, that's too much to pay for any game. And then there's also a 3DS Legend of Korra game, but that is obviously a completely different game from the console version that most people would want to play. Legend of Korra lets you play as Korra between seasons 2 and 3 of the show, so by that point she's basically fully realized and her powers are mostly fully developed, making for some really fun looking gameplay. And Transformers Devastation is a game set in the universe of the original cartoon, which I imagine is really fun for fans of classic Transformers. And it sucks because I, and I assume a lot of other people, didn't know these games even existed until they were already made unavailable. Especially with the resurgence in popularity that Avatar had in 2020 during the early parts of the pandemic, really bringing a lot of new eyes to the franchise. Apparently both these games are really fun, and I have no doubts that they are, since again, they're made by PlatinumGames, who make really fun games. Except for Babylon's Fall, which is also now delisted and totally shut down. On the bright side, Babylon's Fall did last a bit longer than Concord, which, that's something to brag about, I think. But sometimes games get delisted, and against all odds, they come back, however rarely it may happen. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, was a tie-in beat-em-up game that tied in with the Scott Pilgrim movie back in 2010. It was a digital-only title, so when it was delisted in 2014, that seemed like it was the end of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game. And people were devastated because Scott Pilgrim has a very big cult fan base, and the game is apparently really, really well made. I mean, the game is also a work of art to look at. The sprite work here is phenomenal. For a long time, and honestly probably to this day, for a lot of people, Scott Pilgrim was the go-to example of a delisted game. And then the unthinkable happened. In 2021, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, got an official re-release in the form of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, the Complete Edition. On top of that, it was even printed physically this time to ensure that the game would not get delisted and lost again. A couple of LEGO games, particularly the LEGO Middle-earth games, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, were delisted in 2018 due to licenses expiring, but they were relisted the following year in 2019 due to licenses being renewed. And looping back to Telltale, they actually had all of their games delisted for a little while after they closed down, including The Walking Dead, Tales from the Borderlands, Batman, like everything. Everything was gone. While sadly many of their games are still delisted, most of the big ones like The Walking Dead, Wolf Among Us, etc. were relisted again once the studio reopened and started to find their footing again. So there's still some hope, however slim, that maybe someday we can see some of their older games get re-released in some way, shape, or form. But there are even some games that have been delisted again after being relisted, like the Deadpool game. The game first launched in 2013 for the PS3, 360, and PC, and is a pretty standard hack and slash game that is completely carried by its characters, the most obvious one being Deadpool. The game didn't do super well critically or commercially, and it ended up being delisted by the end of 2013, only 6 months or so since it launched, due to what else? Activision not renewing their license to Deadpool and the other Marvel characters that are in the game. I think the big reason that this game kind of flopped the first time is just because Deadpool wasn't as much of a household name at this point. Basically, all of his appearances outside of comics at this point were him showing up in someone else's show or game, like Spider-Man. I mean, he was also in X-Men Origins before this, but we do not talk about that version of Deadpool. But then Deadpool got his own movie, which introduced him to a bunch of new people, and it skyrocketed his popularity. And so it helped tie in with the movie. Activision relicensed the character and remastered and re-released the game for the Xbox One, PS4, and put it back up on PC in late 2015 to, cash in on the movie, which came out a couple months later. And I'm assuming that the game did at least a little bit better while it was re-released, since it stayed up longer than it did the first time. But, as you know, it was delisted again in 2017, practically 2 years to the day since it was relisted. Apparently the game was briefly relisted on Steam to tie in with Deadpool 2, but other than that, there's been no signs that it'll ever come back. If it was going to, it probably would have been when Deadpool and Wolverine released, which obviously did not happen, although the release of that movie did cause the prices of physical copies of the Deadpool game to shoot up in price, making it even harder to get your hands on than it was before. So while games do occasionally get relisted, it's by no means common, and even if a game does come back, there's no guarantee it won't get delisted again. And I basically just stuck to big, notable titles that released on consoles. There's hundreds of games that only released on PC and have met a similar fate. It's not even to mention when entire digital storefronts get shut down, like how when the 360 store shut down not too long ago, it rendered every game that isn't backwards compatible unpurchasable. Games getting delisted is one of the reasons why I really like physical media. Call me old-fashioned, but I like owning the games I play. And it's one of the reasons why I think games should continue getting printed physically, and that physical should at least remain an option for preservation's sake, so that more games do not get lost to time. But that's basically all I have to talk about for today. Are there any other games that you think that I missed, notable or otherwise? I used DelistedGames.com for research and for getting exact dates for this video, since they have a very comprehensive database of games that have been delisted, and some of the ones on there might shock you. If you're interested in the topic and you have some time to kill, I recommend you go check it out. But anyways, that's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to show your support. It really means a ton. Peace out and God bless. I'm Tactic Zombies, and I'll catch you next time.
Yeah, cause I got it like that. Flow so smooth like I got it on tap. Yeah, and I'ma say it be a good night while I'm on my Yingling, while I'm drinking Bud Light. Can you get it when you miss